Havana was the first great capital, music capital of the hemisphere. And this already started in the 16th century when Havana was the drop-off point, the place where the fleet that was bringing Europe a money supply ripped out of the bowels of Mexico and Peru stopped. It took weeks, months to get the fleet ready to go, ready to ship out. It was the most heavily defended point in the hemisphere. And during these weeks and weeks, sailors, large numbers of them, would do what sailors do, hang out, drink, dance, whore, gamble. And this Havana was already a center of where all of the creolizing Afro-Latin musics that were already almost immediately began played all over the hemisphere. They all wound up in the melting pot of Havana for a little while before going back to Spain. There's a back and forth current between Havana and Spain that went on for over 200 years. Every year, the new jams, the new dances would come in from Havana to Spain, and it was, of course, a two-way street, so whatever was new in Europe would wind up in Havana as well. This process is profound. The classic example is the saraband of the Baroque dance suite, which was the sarabanda, which was a dance, a lascivious dance that we first mention of it is in Panama and comes back via Havana to Sevilla and up through the New World, and then many years later winds up slowed down and much less rhythmic in the repertoire of J.S. Bach. So there's a process that's been going on a long time here. In the 20th century, Cuban music, Ortiz would have called it reverse transculturation, traveled to Africa and became very important basic music to Africa. The style soukous from the Congo, that grew out of the Cuban style that was retransplanted back there. So Cuban music is enormously influential. In the 19th century, there were 3 cities in the hemisphere with opera companies: Havana, New Orleans, and New York. And of the 3, Havana's was generally acknowledged the best. The contact between Havana and New Orleans is particularly important because New Orleans became a city under the Spanish when the governor of Louisiana reported to the Captain General of Cuba, and for the last third of the 18th century, that transcendental period that included the American, Haitian, and French revolutions, when Louisiana was under Spain, was a colony of Spain. During that period, the linkage was very tight, and it was both a black linkage as well as a Spanish linkage. There was a Congo current between New Orleans and Havana. All this is very deeply embedded in the culture of our hemisphere. Louis Moreau Gottschalk in 1860, the last antebellum year, publishes Ojos Criollos, Danse Cubaine in New Orleans, Cuban dance using the boom, boom, boom rhythm that is now, we now know it as reggaeton. Same, it's the Antillean beat. Boom, 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 right hand, bong, gong, king, gong, gong, king, gong, gong, king, bong. If you listen to it, it sounds like ragtime. Very much like ragtime, but it's 35 years before the ragtime boom. And it's a danse cubain. This influence has been going on for a long time. The peanut vendor in 1931 transformed the music of the world, quite literally, brought new instruments and a new way of playing. African-American music was in swing time. These guys were playing straight time, linked together by a clave. It's the other great tradition in terms of music. So within the hemisphere, Cuban music plays a central role. We have these 2 great traditions in opposition to each other, the African-American and the Afro-Cuban. In the 50s, I mean, every week 50 million people heard Marco Risso's I Love Lucy theme. I'm quite serious. It was just a part and parcel of North American culture. Incidentally, I don't use the term American to refer to the United States in opposition to Cuba, because the Cubans are under the impression that they too are Americans. But the Chano Pozo with Dizzy Gillespie is not just important as something important that happened in jazz. Chano Pozo made a fundamental revolution in American music, apart from introducing the tumbadora or conga drum into the repertoire. into the instrumentarium. He also showed a new way to play, a new way to stack up a polyrhythm. And every black musician in the United States was aware of Manteca. It was Dizzy's biggest record. In New Orleans, the impact of Cuban music was intense. In many places, the hotels, if you look at the New Yorker from 1952, the hotels in New York would have one American band and one Latin band for dancing, because Cuban music was pretty much identical with dancing in the United States in the 50s. Much of our idea of a nightclub is modeled on something that happened in Cuba. The Las Vegas cabaret show is modeled on the Havana Tropicana type review. So much of this is so deep in our musical DNA. And then we got rock and roll. And rock and roll is pretty much built on the template of Cuban music in many ways, especially the cha-cha-cha, which was a fundamental template of rock and roll. Cha-cha-cha blew up in 1953, before Elvis. It was already happening. Take a classic example here in Los Angeles, where two very important pieces of fundamental rock and roll got happening, both for Mexican kids who wanted to dance cha-cha-cha as the audience. The big band leader, Cuban band leader in LA was René Troset, who had a number by Rosendo Ruiz Jr. called El Loco Cha-Cha in his repertoire. Amar en el Loco was the title in Cuba. And in his arrangement of it, the rhythm went ding, 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 ding. You know where I'm going with that, right?